Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Now, for our final speaker for this year's incarnation of Science Teller, we are beyond fortunate, I would say, to have the best-selling author, science historian, and of course, the skeptic, Michael Shermer. I'm tempted to say that Michael needs no introduction, and I think that's probably true for most of the people in this room. However, just in case, and because we are at the bottom of the world here in Dunedin, and I'm aware that not all Kiwis have necessarily had the privilege of being exposed to Michael's singular wisdom when it comes to why so many human beings believe in so many weird things. In fact, that was one of the titles of his best-selling books, 16, according to my count, 16 books, among numerous other publications, countless publications. Allow me to give you some very brief introduction to Michael Shermer and who he is. Without mincing words, Michael is one of the most celebrated, widely syndicated, and most read public intellectuals writing today. He is a one-time fundamentalist Christian, which I'm not sure he boasts about that, but it's part of his story, his backstory. He went on to found the Skeptic Society and is today the editor-in-chief of Skeptic magazine, which is 55,000 strong in terms of subscribers. He's become famous, or maybe infamous is a better word, for his frank, no-holds-barred deconstructions of supernatural, pseudoscientific, and otherwise irrational claims. So a few of his takedowns, you can find them readily online or in his books, include conspiracy theories, identity politics, which is a very contemporary issue, Bigfoot, UFOs, the existence of God. Those are interestingly juxtaposed. And the reason he's here, the afterlife, the existence of the afterlife. As a fearless advocate for empirically informed rationality and secular humanism, and you probably would have gotten a glimpse of this yesterday from his debate. He's been something of a media darling as well. He's appeared as a guest on everything from Oprah Winfrey to Larry King Live to the Colbert Report to just a month or so ago, the Joe Rogan podcast. And in his latest, and I would say maybe his most powerful book, Heavens on Earth, a scientific search for immortality, the afterlife, and utopia, which has been praised by everyone from Jared Diamond to Neil deGrasse Tyson to Deepak Chopra. Michael leaves no stone unturned, really, on the very questions we've been exploring all weekend long at this Science Teller event. And so for the concluding keynote of Science Teller 2019, Michael has kindly agreed to travel all the way from his home in California, all the way across the globe, really, to share with us just a tiny bit of what he's uncovered in this particular area. So would you please join me in welcoming Michael Shermer to the stage?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for that introduction. Try to live up to it. I'm glad to be here, and I'll try not to repeat myself from the comments I made yesterday in the debate, as well as in response to some of the other speakers, which I really enjoyed. We've largely gotten talks on the psychology of belief, the anthropology of belief, and so forth, which I'm super fascinated by, and it's about half of my day job, the other half being, as an activist, asked, is it true? So what do you mean by true? What do we mean by is something true or is it real? That's a harder question to get at, and it's not unrelated to the questions of why people believe these things, because at some point you have to get out of your head, and it has to move beyond the internal mystical experience. So yesterday I was asked about DMT, the spirit molecule, and ayahuasca, and we talked a little bit about taking trips like that. So I want to make a few comments about near-death experiences again, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about these experiences in terms of what they really represent. And what we really want to know is it just in somebody's skull, or does it represent something out there in the world that you're going to? And clearly it matters, or else people wouldn't be so interested in these topics. And they're used as empirical evidence. It claims that, yes, heaven is real, and you go there. And this is the evidence for it, one of the evidences. So let me just, because I was just talking off the top of my head yesterday, but let me just kind of zero in on a few points. You know, the NDE, the N is super important. It's near death, not dead, near death. That's very different. So I interviewed an OR doctor in Oregon named Mark Crisplet, who reviewed original EEG readings of a number of patients claimed by scientists as being flatlined or dead, and discovered that they weren't dead at all. What they showed was slowing, attenuation, and other changes, but only a minority of patients had a flatline, and it took longer than 10 seconds. The curious thing was that even a little blood flow in some patients was enough to keep EEGs normal. Crisplet also analyzed the NDE study by Pim van Lommel and his colleagues, published in the prestigious British medical journal Lancet, in which the authors define clinical death as a period of unconsciousness caused by insufficient blood supply to the brain because of inadequate blood circulation, breathing, or both. If in this situation CPR is not started within 5 to 10 minutes, irreparable damage is done to the brain and the patient will die. That close quote from that journal article. As Crisplet notes, however, most of these cardiac patients were given CPR, which by definition delivers oxygenated blood to the brain. That's the whole point of doing it. By the definitions presented in the Lancet paper, nobody experienced clinical death, Dr. Crisplet concluded, adding that as a physician who has conducted CPR many times, quote, no doctor would ever declare a patient in the middle of a code 99 dead, much less brain dead. Having your heart stop for 2 to 10 minutes and being promptly resuscitated doesn't make you clinically dead. It only means your heart isn't beating and you may not be conscious. Okay, so that's the near-death part. Now what we want to know is it a hallucination only, or is it representing something, you know, traveling, opening the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley famously said, to this other world? And I mentioned yesterday taking an ayahuasca trip, and most of the people that do it swear that they went somewhere else. But I don't know that they didn't go somewhere else. But again, the burden of proof is not on me to explain that prove that they didn't. What we want to know is, how do you get out of somebody's head and into some kind of common reliable knowledge? It's not just an opinion or an experience or an intuition, which is fine for you individually, for me individually, but to convince you or all of us or the scientific community or whoever, we have to do better than that. We have to achieve some kind of reliable knowledge, objective knowledge in that sense. So the most famous story, NDE story, is that of Ibn Alexander, the most famous in the last few years because he wrote this book, Proof of Heaven. Proof. I don't know if he picked the title or whatever, but proof. And also he's Harvard-trained neurologist, so of course that lends a lot of cred to his story. And anyway, so he was in a coma, induced coma as it turns out, which he forgets to mention in the book, that was induced by, he had a brain virus and his brain was swelling, so they induced the coma so they could give him drugs to decrease the swelling of his brain, and then they bring him out. Well, and he also fails to mention that this experience he had happened when he was coming out of the coma. Okay, so what happened there? There, he took this trip to heaven. There he met a young woman with high cheekbones, deep blue eyes, and golden brown tresses framing her face. Together they traveled on the wing of a butterfly. In fact, millions of butterflies were all around us. Vast fluttering waves of them, dipping down into the woods and coming back up around us again. It was a river of life and color moving through the air. This woman's outfit was simple, like a peasant's, but its colors, powder blue, indigo, and pastel orange peach, had the same overwhelming, super vivid aliveness that everything else had. Alexander was then overwhelmed with a feeling of love, not friendship, or romantic, but somehow beyond all these, beyond all the different compartments of love we have down here on earth. It was something higher, holding all those other kinds of love within itself, while at the same time being much bigger than all of them. And her message to him was simple, quote, "You are loved and cherished dearly forever." Okay, it's a powerful story, and wouldn't it be great if that was true? The question is it true? Compare Eben Alexander's trip with the trip taken by the neuroscientist, my friend Sam Harris, after he and a friend ingested a dose of a drug called MDMA, better known as ecstasy, which he details in the opening pages of his book, Waking Up. Harris reports that he was suddenly struck by the knowledge that I loved my friend. Not friendship or romantic, but this feeling had ethical implications that suddenly seemed as profound as they now sound pedestrian on the page. I wanted him to be happy. More than this, Harris says, came the insight that irrevocably transformed my sense of how good human life could be. I was feeling boundless love for one of my best friends, and I suddenly realized that if a stranger had walked through the door at that moment, he or she would have been fully included in this love. Okay, so then half an hour later, it's gone. So what's the difference between those two stories? And Sam clearly tells us exactly what the neurochemistry was of why he had this experience of intense love. Eben Alexander says, I don't know what happened, but I think I went to heaven. Well, we do know what happened. Let me follow up on that. After this book became a bestseller, his doctor came forward and said, not quite. And let's see if I can find that. Yes, Dr. Laura Potter. This was in an article published in The Atlantic. The attending physician the night Eben Alexander was wheeled into the ER says that Alexander's coma was induced by her in order to keep him alive while he was heavily medicated, and that whenever they tried to wake him up, he thrashed about, pulling at his tubes and trying to scream. So his brain was not completely shut down. He says, my cortex was completely shut down. No, it wasn't. When Potter later challenged him on this point, Alexander told her that his account was artistic license and dramatized, so it may not be exactly how it went, but it's supposed to be interesting for readers. Okay, herein lies the problem. We want reliable knowledge to know what really happened and what's actually true. Not metaphorically true or psychologically true, which is all fine in its own place, but here it's being used as empirical evidence of an afterlife for which it's not. I then talk about Oliver Sacks's books. Every one of his books, every chapter is a case study of a neurological problem that one of his patients has. And they're all just fantastic stories of these kinds of events and experiences that people have with a clear, distinct neurological issue, a tumor, brain damage, whatever. And so he actually wrote about Eben Alexander's case in this Atlantic article, in another Atlantic article. Sacks explained that the reason hallucinations seem so real is that they deploy the very same systems in the brain that actual perceptions do. When one hallucinates voices, the auditory pathways are activated. When one hallucinates a face, the fusiform face area, normally used to perceive and identify faces in the environment, is stimulated. The fusiform gyrus is in the temporal lobe just above your ears here. And people that have brain damage there cannot recognize faces, or they have a weird neurological thing. They're face blind. They think when you show them a face, what are they looking at? Well, they go, well, it's like an apple with a slit in it and two wormholes or something. I mean, they're not seeing a face, which is pretty strong evidence that, mind is, it's just a word we use to describe what the brain is doing. So Sacks continues here. The one most plausible hypothesis for Dr. Alexander's case, then, is that his NDE occurred not during his coma, but as he was surfacing from the coma and his cortex was returning to full function. It is curious that he does not allow this obvious and natural explanation, but instead insists on a supernatural one. Okay, so this has been my experience talking, in a quarter century of activism and skepticism is The power of a personal experience is so overwhelming that no matter what somebody's intelligence, education, background, and so on, training, doesn't matter. That this happened to me. I've met Eben Alexander on several TV shows, sitting in the green room, chatting it up before or after. Doc, you know more than I know about the brain. You know about all the stuff I write about and talk about. He goes, yes, but this was different. I go, I know, they're all different personally. They're all unique in a certain way. But clearly you see that everybody else, was caused by these things, but yours is different. That has been my experience. I wrote about that in The Believing Brain with this fellow that had one of these visions in the middle of the night, 4 in the morning, when they often happen. And this voice gave him this message, which this guy named Chick D'Arpino wouldn't tell me what the message was. It was 13 words. And anyway, but the next day he decided it was his mission to go to the White House and tell the president about this good news he got from this alien being about this 13-word message. And so when he's telling me the story, I said, wait, so when did this happen? It was like, 66. I'm like, President Johnson? You went to see President Johnson during all the Vietnam War protests at the White House, and you're showing up to deliver a message from God or the aliens? He goes, yep. I said, so what happened? He goes, I ended up in this mental institution anyway. So it was a very amusing story, which sort of reminds me of I don't know if you know that book, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. Ypsilanti, Michigan is a city with a mental hospital called Ypsilanti. And the psychiatrist at the time had 3 different patients who each of them thought they were Jesus. And so he thought, I'll get them all together and they'll see that the whole thing is a delusion. And of course, exactly what you would expect happened. Each of the 2 thought the other guy was crazy, and that each of them thought the other 2 were crazy, and he was the real Jesus. Anyway, again, the power of these personal experiences is beyond measure. And anyway, so I go through all the lines of evidence. You can stimulate this part of the temporal lobe in a famous experiment that Olaf Blanc did with an epileptic patient. So they're opening the brain up to tap around to figure out where the seizures are starting so they can zap those neurons. And anyway, you get permission ahead of time to wake the patient up after you've cut through the bone and muscles and all that. And then you poke around and you ask them what's going on. It's one way to map the brain. So you put in this one particular spot on the temporal lobe. But the patient is lying there in the bed, this woman, and she says, well, I'm up by the ceiling now. And now I'm way up as they ratchet up the electricity and they back down. Okay, now I'm back just above the bed. And they tap around. Oh, my left leg is up. Now my right leg is up. My left arm, my right arm. It's just a map of the human body in that particular area for whatever reason there. And they're controlling it completely. Of course, she's just lying there, flat on the bed. She's not moving. So it's all in her head. Okay. Dr. James Winery, a U.S. Air Force pilot, accelerated pilots until they pass out in the centrifuge part of their training. Most of them have these little dreamlet experiences where they float out of their body, white light, the tunnel, and so on. It's hypoxia. Just the oxygen deprivation as the blood is being shunted to the core of the body and brain, it's being shunted away from the visual cortex, away from the retina, and as the retina is shutting down, you're getting this kind of tunneling effect, or as the impulses are coming from the retina to the visual cortex, that's also shutting down as the blood is shunting. So this is another explanation for why you're getting some of these visual effects. So if you add all these up, again, I can't prove that somebody's not going somewhere, but the inference to the best explanation, as philosophers of science like to say, is that it's all in the skull. It's all in the brain. No one's going anywhere. And it's irrelevant that people their lives are changed and so on. That's great, but lives are changed by many life experiences where people report, oh, I changed my life, I quit smoking, whatever. And so that's kind of irrelevant. It's interesting, but irrelevant to the question is what's really true. Okay. Then I wanted to address the question no, there was one more here, sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the core of my book is really not the religious versions of the afterlife, although those are also amusing, as I mentioned yesterday. They don't converge to any one particular story. And related to that, by the way, to this morning's talk and one of the questions, if you go in an NDE, if you go to heaven and there's Jesus, There he is sitting next to God, or however that works. Problem of identity there, but let's set that aside for a moment. If a Jew went there in an NDE, or a Muslim went there in an NDE and came back and said, that's it, I saw Jesus, there he was, I couldn't believe it, we were wrong, and he converts, that would be impressive. Okay, that would be a little nudge toward the more empirical, evidential side of the NDEs being real. But that never happens. Okay, why not? You know, that's inquiring minds want to know. Okay, so, yeah, and then I also mentioned my friend Julia Sweeney. If you've never seen her monologue, Letting Go of God, it's a few years old now. Julia was a cast member of Saturday Night Live, and she's a brilliant, funny monologuist. So she did a monologue about losing her religion. She was raised Catholic, and then it was reading Dawkins and me and Sam and other people, and decided, I don't think I believe this anymore. So she tells a story about this, and it's very, very amusing, about how she is at home in Hollywood, and the Mormon boys come to her door, knock on the door, and they want to give her the pitch, right, about the Mormon story. So they go into so she invites them in because she's friendly, and they go into the whole story about, you know, the angel Moroni came, and Joseph Smith, you know, got the gold tablets, and he translated them from Egyptian hieroglyphics into English using these magic stones that he put in his hat, and put his face in his hat and dictated them, and it just goes on. And what is the story? The story is, you know, that after he was crucified and on his way to heaven, Jesus stopped by America, and he visited the Lamanites and the Nephites, who were the lost tribes of Israel that came to America, and one of them became super bad, and those became the Native Americans. It just goes on and on. So Julia says, I just wanted to tell him, okay, don't start with this story. This is crazy. Even the Scientologists know, don't start with the Xenu Galactic Warrior story. Start with a personality test, and then, you know, okay. So, but then they tell her, you know, well, it's going to be great when you go to heaven because you get to spend all eternity with your family. And she says, oh, that would not be good for me. Which is another thing. I mean, eternity. Wow, okay. And that you get your whole body back, like the blind shall see and the deaf shall hear and the handicapped shall be made whole again. And Julia says, well, I had uterine cancer, and so I don't have my uterus anymore. Do I get my uterus back? You can imagine these 18-year-old starch white shirt boys on their bicycles going, what's a uterus again? And they said yes, and she goes, I don't want it back. And what if you had a nose job and you liked it? You know, so I mean, it's funny, but there's some really deep philosophical issues here about the afterlife. I mean, what is it? Where are you going? Are you physically there? You know, do you get your you get your own nose back? I mean, what does this even mean? And even if God reconstructs your body, He's not resurrecting it out of the grave. He's reconstructing, like a transporter on Star Trek, an actual physical body out of new atoms or something in exactly the same pattern you were. Why would you not age then and get cancer and so on? Well, He fixes all that. Well, but then that's not you, because He'd have to, you know, reprogram your entire genome to prevent aging and diseases and all those normal things. That's you. So whatever that is, that's not you. And it just goes on and on from there. Anyway, so, but I'm not just picking on religion, because the mind uploaders, the singularity people, the transhumanists, and I go through all their theories about cryonics and being frozen and brought back in 1,000 years, which would be pretty interesting. You could come back as a historian. You know, the Nixon speech, I saw it. I was there. Anyway, but none of those will work for various reasons that I discussed. The one that's most popular now amongst the Silicon Valley crowd is copying your connectome and uploading it into the cloud. Okay, so, and I mentioned this yesterday, you know, you're not just your memory self, you're also your point of view self from one moment to the next. So philosophers have a whole thing about identity. Who are you, the self? What does that even mean? So if you copied your brain and cut it in half and gave it to somebody else, is that you? And so on. Derek Parfitts has a whole book about this. It's kind of like the Star Trek problem. But the problem is much worse than that. So let me just kind of go through some of these things. You know, you're talking about about 85 billion neurons, each of which has maybe 1,000 connections. So that's 85 trillion connections you have to copy. Okay, every computer in the world would not be able to store a single brain just with that. Then there's the glial cells in the brain. So there's another, depending on which neuroscientist you talk to, another 85 billion to 850 billion glial cells that support the neurons. So And they're involved in neural activity, so you'd have to copy those. Then you have to factor in about 10 billion proteins per neuron, which affect how memories are stored, plus the countless extracellular molecules in between those tens of billions of brain cells. You really need to copy those, because they're all involved, and that's just your memory self. And then there's your embodied brain, which is the rest of your body. You know, it doesn't stop right here. You got your, the spinal cord and all the nerves and so on. That's part of you, right? So you really got to do the clone body thing. You can't just do the head unit, which is cheaper for the cryonics anyway. It's actually not that expensive. You could just get an insurance policy for a couple grand a year as the premium, and you make the cryonics company the beneficiary of the insurance policy. That's how that works, by the way. I'm not recommending this. It won't work, but and anyway, so then you also have the problem of memory. So whether it's a religious version and you're resurrected in heaven, or it's the singularity and we upload you to the cloud, that's a snapshot of you at the moment that the copy is made. But we know memories are not fixed. It's not like a video camera and they're recording it and we now have the disk and here's all the memories. It isn't like that, as we know. So whatever the snapshot copy is made, that's just the memories you have at that moment, which are not reliable. I mean, the memories are constantly changing throughout the lifetime. So again, how old are you when you're taken to heaven or copied? That's not you, that fixed age 30, or in my case, 60-something. Okay, 64. So whatever God or the far future computer is going to do with this, it has to do all of that. And then there is all of the interactions you had with other people and all of the forces, social, political, economic, cultural forces that shape your life. That would kind of need to be duplicated as well if we're going to plop you down into a new environment to start living your life again. Is this what we're talking about is heaven? It would be something like, well, Frank Tipler wrote this book, The Physics of Immortality, where he estimated, his theory was that in the very far future of the universe, the omega point, he called it, that virtual reality will be so good it's indistinguishable from this reality, and that you could replicate everyone who ever lived or even could have lived with a computer powerful enough that it has 10 to the 10 to the 123 bits. That's a 1 followed by 10 to the 123 zeros. Okay, this is a massive computer. But I claim that it couldn't even do that, because that would not be enough, because he's just talking about copying a person. You'd have to just individual persons. You'd have to copy all their interactions and the whole history of the universe. In other words, the only way this would work is if you just replicated the universe, the entire thing, and reran it. If that's heaven, then we're living in it. This is it. Maybe the whole thing's a matrix, okay, in a simulation, but that's another. I'm skeptical of that too, by the way, because I'm quite certain that I'd see some pixelation or some buffering every once in a while, and there doesn't seem to be any glitches other than current president of the United States. Okay. All right, then I'll just wrap it up and say, okay, so what does this all mean? So first of all, it's kind of irrelevant. I don't know if there's an afterlife or not. I assume the default null hypothesis there probably isn't. And if there is, maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised. Although I modify it by saying maybe, because as Christopher Hitchens famously described the Christian heaven, this would be like celestial North Korea, where you have this dictator that knows every one of your thoughts and controls you forever. This does not sound good. Hitch liked to say that, death is like, you're at a party and it taps you on the shoulder and says, you have to leave now. And by the way, the party's going to go on. So okay, so you feel bad about that. But let's say it could be even worse. Death taps you on the shoulder and says, you can never leave the party. Well, ever? I mean, I like parties, but not forever. That's even worse, okay? So I'm not at all sure that whatever the version of heaven is necessarily a good thing. And of course, we don't even know what that would be. So, but what's the point? Okay, so here I call this Alvey's error, since Woody Allen's been invoked in this conference several times. And you recall in Annie Hall, Woody Allen plays Alvey Singer, a comedian. And there's a flashback scene where he's a young boy and he refuses to do his homework, and his mom takes him to the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, what's wrong, Alvey? He said, the universe is expanding. So, the The universe is everything there is, and if it's expanding, then one day it's all going to blow up, and so there's no point in doing my homework. And his mother upbraids him and says, what's the universe got to do with it? We live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn's not expanding. So, and that's kind of my take-home message from the book, is that it doesn't really matter. We don't live in the afterlife. We live in this life. We don't live in the hereafter. We live in the here and now. We live in Brooklyn, not the universe. And now we have a lot of research on what it takes to live a meaningful, happy, fulfilling life with or without belief in God or the afterlife or any of that. I mean, you can get it that way or not. So I just kind of rifle through a lot of this research you all know pretty well. Just correlates of happiness and self-satisfaction are things like love and family, meaningful work and career, social and political, cultural involvement in projects, and transcendency and spirituality. Now, mind you, as I mentioned yesterday, religion is too big a word, encompasses too many things. There's lots of different specific ways and things that you could do to feel transcendent, to feel spiritual, to feel in awe and wonder of the universe or whatever. You can get it in cathedrals. I love visiting cathedrals in Europe, for example, but I also try to visit observatories whenever I can at the top of a mountain, and you sit inside that dome and there's a huge telescope and you look at the night sky. To me, it's every bit as good as Chartres Cathedral or the dome in Cologne, where my wife is from. We go there every year. It's fantastic. It's deeply moving, but so is an astronomical observatory. Lots of different ways to get those. And challenges and goals. We all need to get up in the morning and have some reason to get out and challenge ourselves and so on. And then I also make a distinction between happiness and meaningfulness. So this is an important research by Roy Baumeister and his colleagues, as some of you know Roy pretty well, apparently. So he makes a distinction between, mind you, this is all self-report data for whatever that's worth, but that's all we have. And feeling like happy at the moment, to give you those buzzers back in the 90s, and how do you feel right now, throughout the day. And so happiness seems to be related to more short-term, immediate things, like that I've just made some money, or I've just went to dinner with my friends, and those sorts of things may make you feel happy temporarily. But when Roy and his colleagues kind of dug into this, they realized, but that's different from, do you feel like you've had a meaningful life? And that has more to do with long-term goals related to challenges and so on. So one analogy I make is like your parents caring for you or a loved one caring for you. That can lead to happiness because you feel better about being loved and cared for and so on. You caring for a parent. So I've had to do this twice, in which I was the primary caretaker for two of my four elderly parents. I had step-parents. And this wasn't fun at all. I was not happy driving my dad around to all these hospitals and so on. But I felt better about myself. Like, I'm better for doing this, and maybe my kids will do this for me. But that's not why I did it. It was just like, that's... And so anyway, so Baumeister and his colleagues, they find out, indeed, that's exactly the kind of thing that, it's not like you love your family, you have a family, but so it's not that family makes you happy, it's that they make you give you a more meaningful life. And so projects like volunteering for nonprofits and working for churches or causes or whatever, it's not fun in the way of, I'm getting happy now doing this. It's more of a long-term meaningful thing. So anyway, then, so I'll just read the final paragraph from the book. So, facing death and life with courage, awareness, and honesty can bring out the best in us and focus our minds on what matters most, gratitude and love. Gratitude for a chance at life, given the biological reality that those 100 billion people who lived before us were, in fact, only a tiny fraction of the many trillions of people who could have been born but were not. The chance encounter of sperm and egg that led to each of us could just as well have produced someone else, and you would never know it because there would be no you to know. Once born, we are each unique, a concatenation of genes and brains with thoughts, feelings, memories, histories, and points of view that can never be duplicated here or in the hereafter. Our sentience, yours, mine, and everyone's, is ours alone and like no other anywhere in the cosmos. We are given this one chance to live, some 80 trips around the sun, a brief but glorious moment in the cosmic drama unfolding on this provisional proscenium. Given all we know about the universe and the laws of nature, that is the most any of us can reasonably hope for. Fortunately, it is enough. It is the soul of life. It is heaven on earth. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I want to certainly leave enough time for questions from the audience because I'm sure a lot of people have some things that they'd like to run by you and get your perspective.
Well, I'm here till Tuesday, so we got plenty of time.
But before we get into that, one of the things that we haven't spent a lot of time on, and you alluded to this in your talk just now, would be some of the biotechnical innovations for crafting an actual literal immortality. So we've talked quite a bit about the sort of ethereal realm and sort of becoming a disembodied spirit after biological death and going to heaven and so forth. But there are scientists that are quite utilitarian, that are trying to stop the aging process or create a literal immortality. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those advances?
Yeah, so I call these afterlives for atheists because they figure, well, there's no afterlife, but we got to create it here. So I mentioned cryonics, and they've improved their techniques since the first people were frozen in the 60s. But still, I'm not convinced that until there's an actual experiment done, say with a dog, not just chilled, but frozen for days or whatever at minus 160 degrees and so on, where all molecular motion stops, that can be reversed and then woken up again. So I'm maintaining my skepticism for that. And I noticed that a lot of the Silicon Valley immortalists, they don't wear the cryonics bracelet. You got to wear the bracelet with the phone number, so in case you keel over. It gives you instructions. Call this number and pack the body in ice and so on.
Get it on ice really quickly.
Yeah, on ice very quickly, yeah, because, well, as Mary Roach wrote about, the decomposition starts really fast. So you got to. Anyway, so then you have the radical life extensionists, people like Ray Kurzweil, who's a super smart guy. I mean, he's the head of engineering for Google. That's a big job. And, he's a world-class inventor, and he wants to defeat death. Not just him. I mean, Larry Page at Google, they funded Calico. One of their, Alphabet is the company now, funded Calico, which is a longevity company, and Jeff Bezos, Peter Thiel. These guys have real money to throw. They could throw a couple $100 million at a longevity thing, which I think is great because, and here's my take on that, because people say, Shermer, don't you want to live to be 500 years? I go, look, just get me to 90, say, without, prostate cancer, and get me to 100 without Alzheimer's, and then we'll talk. Just, one increment at a time. Because the aging thing is, again, it's not like a light switch. There's no single thing. There's, just 100 different things happen in your body over, kind of a slope from, say, about age 75 or so. It really starts to drop off. If they can solve those specific things, like Alzheimer's would be huge. Us baby boomers are going to hit the wall here pretty soon, and the numbers projected for the number of people having Alzheimer's is really scary large, and how expensive that is for the healthcare system and so on. If they could solve that, in other words, don't worry about 500. Just get to 100 with a healthy life in which you're engaged. So all the things that they're talking about, like Ray takes 240 vitamins a day or something. I've sit there with him, and he's sitting like this all day long. He just pees it out. It's just your body just is not processing that.
How old is he?
Ray's, well, he's a little old, so I'm 64. I think he's 69 or 70, and I have to say, he looks like he's his age. I mean, Deepak has this book, endless, what is it? Endless Mind, Eternal Age, or some such thing, published back in the 80s when he was young. And you look at the book cover now, people have done this as a meme online, and pictures of Deepak now, it's like, Deepak, it's not working. You'll look like you're the age you are, okay. So the longevity people I've interviewed that work on this professionally with both animals and people say none of this stuff is going to work. We have an upper ceiling of about 120 or so, say, that almost nobody has ever gotten past. And that's not going to change. So when you read about, people live twice as long now as they did a century ago. No, they don't. What do you mean by that? I mean, Darwin lived to be age 79. People lived into their 80s and 90s.
But he looked like 120.
He looked like 120, yeah. Just not very many of them. So all we're seeing is that more and more people, the bell curve is shifting toward the right end of that outside wall, but no one's breaking through the wall. And I'm told there's nothing any of these companies are doing that's going to change that.
If we did defeat death, just hypothetically, or we lived to be 500 years old, how would that affect society? What would be the consequences of
Yeah, marriage, career, these things would be rather different. I'm on my 45th marriage now. This has been kind of played around with, mostly in a negative way, that people are against this idea. Overpopulation, resource depletion, what would this do to jobs and careers? Again, I just say, you know what, let's just, if we can get to 150, let's then see how it goes. And we can deal with whatever ethical, moral issues or environmental issues there are, one step at a time, because it's so unlikely. The analogy, as with AI, this is like worried about the overpopulation problem of Mars because Elon wants to send a rocket there. It's like, let's worry about getting the rocket to Mars first, and then we'll worry about overpopulation in a couple centuries. So that's,
Okay.
And by the way, surveys have asked people, how long do you think you'd like to live? The answers are inevitably pegged to whatever the current lifespan is. Like 80. Oh, I don't know, 80 seems about right. A simple thought experiment shows that you don't really believe that. Because if tomorrow was your 80th birthday and death knocked and tapped you on the shoulder and said, tomorrow's your day, would you like another day? Yeah, I'll take another day. Would you like another year? I would definitely like another year. Thank you very much, and I'll take another decade if I can get it. Of course.
So one of the things that occurred to me with your talk just now, but also earlier, was how you grapple with these difficult conversations with people, perhaps, that they desperately want to believe. So they're emotionally, they're bereaved parents, for instance, and they're absolutely convinced that they've made contact with their child through a medium, and then you come along and you're sort of the killjoy in that sort of explanatory process. Is that difficult for you? How do you?
Yeah, it's kind of a hard one, and atheists talk about this all the time. What do we say to somebody who's grieving? I mean, even Dawkins says, well, I'm not going to say, there's no heaven. you don't have to be a dick about it, but, much of what we're talking about this weekend is sort of an intellectual exercise. It's a separate question from, say, how do you deal with somebody who's grieving? There's a lot of research by clinicians on how to do that. And, doing a skeptic deconstruction of the afterlife is not high on the list.
So you would lean towards some sort of pragmatic approach toward having a conversation with these people that, they're struggling to believe it themselves, perhaps, and they want to believe, and then you come along and...
I've never tried to disabuse somebody of their belief. It just doesn't seem right. When it's clearly important to them emotionally, it's not going to do it. I mean, in a way, that's kind of a separate question. Whatever gets you through the night, life is hard, okay, that's fine. But if you're making some other kind of claim, and I know my religion is the one true religion or whatever, it's like, hang on, now we're going to shift it over here to an intellectual discussion about what is true, not how to live your life. I don't think you need that to lead a fulfilling life, but so many people do, so okay.
Sure. Do you think that this intellectual conversation that we've had all weekend, many sort of hypothetical thought experiments and so on, do you think it's kind of a lost cause in the sense of ever having a rational conversation about the afterlife, that we are working against the grain of human psychology, perhaps, and that we can spend an endless amount of time talking about this, but in fact, the majority of people will still believe that their personal consciousness survives their biological death?
Maybe. I mean, if we were living centuries ago and we had a conference on witches and we were skeptics and it seemed hopeless because outside the walls everybody believes in witches, well, we've disabused pretty much everybody of that now, most people anyway. And so there's progress there. I think it's harder to see in surveys, say from the 1970s to the 2000s, of rates of belief in ghosts or ESP or whatever. But if you go back a few centuries, say the 16th, 15th, and 16th, even into the 17th century, everybody believed in the supernatural and the paranormal. It was just infused in all culture. I mean, there's witches and demons and incubi and succubi. They were just everywhere, and everybody just took it for granted that the reason the tree fell was because so and so bewitched the cow or whatever. Goody Proctor danced with the devil in the middle of the night in Salem, and we got to burn them. I mean, that was pretty common, and we've come a long ways that way. I think there's a lot of real progress there.
Okay. And I'm going to put you on the spot with this last question, and you might not have an immediate answer for me. And maybe somebody has asked you this before, I'm not sure, but what would you like on your gravestone?
No one's ever asked me that, actually. I'll be back.
You never left.
He wanted to know what is true, maybe, something like that.
Does it ever bother you that you, if you are right, you'll actually never get the confirmation that you were?
That's right. Somebody made a comment earlier today about we'll all find out later. Maybe not. Maybe it's just like general anesthesia. 98, 97, 96, boom, boom, lights out, but you're not brought back
You'll never
out.
know that you've actually
You'll
died.
never know. So
If you're right.
That's right. Well, I mean, Socrates made this point, and it's just an old idea. It's just you'll never know. There's no reason to fear death because it's not even a thing to be. There's no experience of death. It's just non-experience.
You can't even confirm the hypothesis that you're mortal.
You can't. No. It's a little bit like this, the title question of issue of Skeptic. Why is there something rather than nothing? And we made nothing, my art director made nothing really hard to read because it's really nothing. Even the word, no thing, it implies that there's a thing that isn't. It's not even that. So we say, imagine there's no universe. Okay, so it's just, take away the stars and planets and so on. No, you have to do more than that. There's no light. There's not even any darkness. And at some point, we're just hitting an epistemological wall of I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, somebody mentioned yesterday, I think, that they were afraid of the prospect of nothingness, but even adding ness onto anything involves the attribution of some sort of perceptible quality that you actually experience, the nessness.
That's right. I mean, now we're the barrier of language. What words do you even use to say there's not even nothing? What can that even mean? And so death is something like that. It's just, nothing, whatever that means. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Michael.
Jesse. Thanks for hosting this great conference.
And we do have some time for questions. We'll just sort of open up the floor for those. We've got 25 minutes or so. So by all means, we've got Michael Shermer here. So if there's anything you'd like to ask him, just raise your hand. We have runners, right?
Awesome. Thanks for that. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. One of the Hitchens quote that you mentioned is one of my favorites as well. I think it highlights one of the feelings we have about death. But the other one is this idea of the null, this nothingness. What do you feel is the big driver for most people, whether it's this inability to envisage or understand the nullness of death, or is it that we are all slightly worried about getting that tap on the shoulder and asked to leave? What do you think do you think it's different for everyone, or do you think there's something that's more weighty?
Yeah, if I understand that question correctly, when surveys ask people why they believe in God, fear of death is not high on the list. The reason people go to religion and religious services, it's not because they're terrified by the prospects of death. There's a lot of other reasons they go that are very positive. Now, I do deal with, in my book, this whole theory, terror management theory, which is based in this idea that we're aware of our own mortality, and this is driving us to be creative and productive and want relationships and moral values and things like this. Writing books, everything. I'm pretty skeptical of this theory. First of all, it's all unconscious, because if you ask people, are you terrified by death? Most people go, well, no, not really. I don't really think about it. Oh, but it's unconscious, so we have to do these priming experiments and so on. Okay, so so I'm not sure that they're measuring what they think they're measuring. I think they might be measuring something else in those primes. Anyway, I have a long discussion of that. So, so how important is that? I think it's in there somewhere, but mostly toward the end of life, or when faced with a loved one who's dying or whatever. Then it comes up, of course, and it's an important subject. But I think it's, why do people go to church or whatever? It's the community, the social capital, friends, free parking in LA, that's a big one. There's a lot of positive values that are not related to this negative thing of death.
In fact, there's no positive correlation between the degree of fear of death and the belief in the afterlife. So I think that's the colloquial explanation, that people believe in life after death because they're afraid of their own mortality. But there's no clear relationship between those two points. So I do think that, although I wouldn't say that it has nothing to do with constructions of the afterlife, I think that, for me at least, as a psychologist, the inability to simulate the experience of the absence of consciousness is a significant motivating force behind belief in the afterlife. Some of the studies that we've looked at with, telling people that there's a guy that's driving along the road, he's got this sort of flurry of thoughts, he's ruminating about all sorts of things, he's sick, he's hungry, he's angry at his wife, and then all of a sudden he accidentally, runs off the road and hits a utility pole and he dies instantaneously. And you ask people questions like, well, can he still taste the flavor of the breath mint that he put into his mouth right before he died? That's not something that most people think about when they conceptualize the afterlife, but people struggle with that, answering that question. Well, if they say no, does that mean that he has the absence of the flavor? Does that mean that you just have the inability to taste anymore? So we don't oftentimes interrogate our own cognitive processes very deeply when it comes to the afterlife. But even with those types of questions, you'll get people that claim to be non-believers who would still say things like, well, of course he knows that he's dead because he's looking around and he sees it's all dark now. So, right. They don't appreciate the irony in an explanation like that.
Right.
The capacity for epistemic states like knowledge.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks again. One of the issues I find kind of threatening about skepticism is its potential to encourage things like solipsism, as through the philosophical zombie problem. And I wonder how we practice skepticism conscientiously in a way that avoids leading us toward more selfish or amoral behavior. And if there's some hope for something like a science of morality in a more objective sense, and particularly if there are any implications of taking a skeptical approach to issues like the afterlife, given what we've seen here about the moral implications of such beliefs.
Yeah, well, so the talk yesterday showing that secular countries that have high levels of trust in secular institutions like the legal system, they don't seem to need that heaven and hell carrot and stick as much. So that's one way to do it. You touched on another deeper subject there, science and morality. There's this Hume's wall that I keep wanting to tear down, this is-ought fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy. Science can say nothing about morality. Nonsense. Of course we can. We can say lots of things about right and wrong and good and evil and so on, and not just understanding why people are moral or whatever, but actual moral choices we make. Not perfectly, and when I say science, I mean the entire body of knowledge, philosophy, and so forth. I don't mean you go to the geologist to find out whether you should get an abortion or not. I mean, just all of human knowledge. And we've been doing that. That was the point of my previous book, The Moral Arc, is tracking that 500-year history of that. So I think we're doing that anyway, even if people say you can't, they do it themselves through that. And then the first part of your question, skepticism, it's kind of gotten a bad rap because of I think the word, people for some weird linguistic reason associate it with cynicism. They have no relationship at all. So, and I kind of struggled with this when we first named the magazine because I thought, the skeptic, there's that word, but it's short and you can put it on a cover shortly as opposed to the rational, philosophical, whatever, it's too long. So I've been trying to kind of reconfigure the meaning of the word as, just sort of open inquiry, sort of a scientific approach. Because that's what, it's just science, really.
That's true. It connotes some sort of closed-mindedness when in fact it's the complete opposite of that.
Complete opposite.
And when you ask a believer, would they even consider the possibility that they're wrong? You don't find that open-mindedness in that direction.
Yeah, there's that great moment when Bill Nye, the science guy, was debating Ken Ham, the young Earth creationist, and the moderator says, well, what would it take for you to change your mind? And Bill goes through, he gave that classic answer that J.B.S. Haldane gave, which was about evolution, was fossil rabbits in the Precambrian, before there were mammals. That would really change the evolutionary theory. And Ken Ham's answer was nothing. Nothing would change my mind, because that's my belief. So
those are the closed-minded people.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I just wanted to point out, in relation to that earlier question about the inability to imagine the absence of consciousness as that being a motivator for belief in the afterlife, that we hear oftentimes this analogy that, I'm not afraid of death because death will be just like it was thousands of years before I was born, and I wasn't afraid of that period of time. But the reality is that we didn't actually experience that period of time, just like we can't consciously experience the state of dreamless sleep or being under general anesthesia. It's not like we know what it was like to be under general anesthesia because there's no likeness to compare it to. So the analogy actually falls flat when we're trying to picture what it will be like to be dead, because we have nothing to draw from in terms of our conscious experience in the past. Even though we've had these moments of the absence of consciousness, we've never actually lived through them to draw from, to compare them to.
Yep, missing time.
I have one question and one story to share with you. My question is that when I was a child, around 25 years ago, I watched the news in my country, and it reported about a CCTV in England. It captured the ghost in an ancient castle in UK. It's a kind of, I'm not sure if it's Buckingham Palace or some ancient castle in UK, and CCTV there, they can capture video footage of the ghost. And how can you make of it? Can it be used as an evidence to prove that there is ghosts and the life after death or not? And are there any scientific investigation on this footage, something like that? And yes.
So video footage of a ghost?
Yes.
At a UK castle?
Yes.
Yeah.
From my memory, around 25 years ago, CCTV camera in UK, in maybe Buckingham Palace or one ancient castle.
Yeah.
I think it's the ghost was a baron, something like that. He dressed like a baron several hundred years ago, around maybe 400 years ago. He dressed like a baron and he just walked in the castle. Yes.
I think I got that. It's a ghost story, right?
I vaguely remember that actually. It was in the news, and there was some. It looked like a ghost on sort of CCTV footage.
Yeah.
In a castle in the UK.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ghosts always like to haunt old castles. They never go to the 7-Eleven Quickie Mart to haunt. Well, and particularly in the case with video footage, cameras, the lenses often have light aberrations in them. 35 millimeter cameras, especially video cameras, particularly in the last half century or so, are not reliable perfectly because you often get these little images that then people associate. If they're in the right state of mind and it's a haunted castle and not the Quickie Mart, then they're more likely to interpret it as a ghost. Then there's the problems that you mentioned with the ghost idea. How does a ghost see anything? If it's going down the hallway and turns right, and how does it know it's supposed to turn right? And how does it see where it's going and navigate the world? How does it move?
Because its visual cortex has decomposed hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, okay.
In this case.
Yes, okay, right. Anyway, so I don't make much about ghost stories. They're fun, but most of them are, there's not actually that many videos. It's mostly just stories that people tell about things that go bump in the night, which has other explanations. Old houses are creaky. There's a train goes by at 3 in the morning, 2 miles away, and it shakes the ground a little bit. There's a bunch of those kinds of explanations. Obviously, I wasn't there. These are usually one-off events that are difficult for skeptics to explain individually, but we can kind of give this collective explanation. This is typically what happens in these cases.
As there hasn't been any sort of unambiguous footage of a ghost.
No.
Would just sort of be the test case and just.
Well, there has been, but they're faked. Yeah. You just have somebody in a sheet behind the door, pop out or whatever. Double exposures, whatever.
Thank you very much. May I share my one story with you? Around 5 years ago, I talked with my colleague who was studying PhD here, and he is a kind of a Christian priest too. And he studied theology here, and he told me that there was a lady approaching him at the church, and she told him that she saw her father died, had just died, and she saw that her father was with her, I think all the time or often, something like that, and she had a kind of subtle communication with her father ghost that she knew that her father was near her, around her, because he wanted to protect her. And so when she told this story to my colleagues, and my colleague said that that is the evil, it's misguided her, it's make her misunderstand, something like that. But when I heard about this story, I didn't think that it's evil, because I'm a Buddhist, and in the Buddhist cosmology, especially in my country, in Thailand, we believe that when we dead, right, when we die, we can be reborn as a ghost in human world as well. It's like even in a house that we used to live as a human, our consciousness can be reborn in that house as a kind of has a subtle body become ghost or subtle being in that house, something like that. So I didn't think it's evil, but my colleague who is a Christian priest here, he said that it's evil and it tried to, how to say, like make her misunderstand, something like that. But I just think that this kind of opinion is prevent us from have more understanding about life after death, because if we say that anything that is not written in religious text is evil work, I think we cannot learn more about it. Yes, thank you.
So I'm just curious, what about a situation where there was reports by trusted sources, trustworthy people who seemed competent, didn't have a manipulative motive, and were just generally in a reasonable state of mind. Multiple people reported seeing a spirit. Do you think that that sort of evidence is in the category of something that would be seen as more persuasive because of the multiple witnesses, assuming that they were credible witnesses? Because so often the experiences, the spiritual experiences that people report are their own private experiences. But what about something where there was either that or like a miraculous event, food multiplying in front of you or something seen by a bunch of people?
Yeah.
Thoughts about those types of experiences?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's certainly in a different category of, it's not like 500 people all had the exact same delusion because they all had magic mushrooms for breakfast or something like that. That's not usually the explanation. I just did a debate last week in Seattle with this theist on miracles, Christian theist. So, the biggest miracle of all, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus. Seen by 500 people after, that he rose after 3 days. He was seen afterwards by 500 people. Well, no, there's one account saying there were 500 people. But even if there were 500 people, You know, in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal, 50,000 people saw the sun stop, swirl around, crash to the ground, and there were doctors and psychiatrists and professors there, you know, smart people, 50,000 people, 500 is nothing. How many of you in the room, I asked this group of, you know, 99% of the room was born-again Christians, so how many of you accept the Fatima story? Well, I actually had a few hands, but it's like, no, of course that's not a true story. It's like, that's barely a century ago with 50,000 people. Why don't you accept that? And there's lots of examples at Lourdes, you know, hundreds of people saw this or that, or another, this Virgin Mary makes her appearance periodically in Catholic countries, in waterfalls and weeping statues and things like that. Even the Catholic Church rejects those as non-miracles. They have natural explanations, or people are faking or whatever. So yes, it's a different category, but it's still kind of in this general not reliable knowledge that even organizations like the Catholic Church don't accept. Although they're not super consistent about that. They kind of rammed through Mother Teresa into sainthood with just one miracle, which was a woman with multiple sclerosis who, touching the gown of Mother Teresa, her multiple sclerosis went into remission for a couple weeks or something like this. It's like, well, you know, these things do that. They kind of cycle in and out, but that was the best they could do. But the Catholic Church famously had the Advocatus Diaboli, the devil's advocate, which was a committee that basically went to investigate claims of miracles because they knew most of them were nonsense. So they actually had their own kind of group of skeptics that would go in there and go, okay, no, the weeping statue, it's just, you know, the oil from the whatever. And so they were actually skeptics.
Mike, hi, thanks again for coming. I've been a big fan for a long time, and I wasn't disappointed. However, I was a little surprised to hear you're more accommodating than I had expected, I guess, in your talk, because I was surprised to hear you say that you're not trying to change people's strongly held beliefs, because I've always thought that your credo would be that it's more important for people to believe things that are true, or it's important for people to believe things that are true. But here you seem to be saying that you're willing to compromise on the truth if it makes them feel
well,
okay.
in the context that Jesse mentioned of,
I mean, but that
somebody's dying there, are you going to try to talk them out? Well, no. You know.
Well, but that context applies. I mean, everything that everyone believes is believes for some reason, and so you could apply everything. Everybody thinks that their beliefs are held for a good reason, and they all serve some sort of psychological function. If you think about like alternative medicine, I assume you don't believe in the effectiveness of many alternative medicines, but those work to the extent they work at all. They work because people, you know, find comfort or believe or think that they're working. Yeah. So that's another case where you could come along and say, well, you know, I shouldn't try to change their belief because that's you know, otherwise you're going to take away the one thing that you know.
Yeah, interesting. Well, no, probably that I might consider that a different category. I mean, if somebody says, look, my cancer went away, you know, I did this extract of seaweed or whatever, essential oils, and my tumor went away. Well, good, I'm glad. It's better than suffering and dying. I'm glad your tumor went away. But in the context, do we really want to know what the cause of that was? And I would say, well, you know, tumors do go into remission. No evidence that essential oils do anything other than they smell nice, and so on. And so it was probably something else. But again, I'm not going to just say, no, you should have died, and it wasn't the, you know. So I guess it's, you know, it's just the context of when you're talking to people about things. More in the intellectual context, yes, be a pit bull. You know, there are debates in the, you know, atheist circles, particularly after Dawkins' 2006, the God delusion, and the atheist movement kind of splintered after that, of, you know, sort of militant atheism, you know, and anti-theism. Let's go after the believers, you know, full bore pit bull by the jugular and just strangle them, versus the kind of more moderates. And then it split again into the sort of social justice warriors, atheist plus, and then the non-social justice warriors, whatever that means. And this is what happens with social movements, you know, as they get larger. They, you know, fusion and then fission. And they splinter over the tiniest little sins. The social justice warrior movement itself is disintegrating as they devour each other over, you know, the wrong pronouns or whatever. You know, it's just insane, but that's what social movements do.
Maybe one more question we have time for. Maybe down here, Alex.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Shermer. One thing that has been covered is utopias. And if there's no afterlife, have you come across a really good utopian community or belief system that works?
What got closest?
Closest on utopian systems. No, they don't work. Well, the problem is that functioning societies are messy. And utopians are almost by definition non-messy, and so they bump up against the realities of how people actually are and interact, and then they collapse. Now, I forget where I was just reading this about, this was yesterday's lecture, I think, wasn't it? That utopias that have, oh, that was it, communes that have more obstacles to joining, in other words, a sacrificial element to get in the club. Do better because there's more of a commitment. And again, I mean, it's hard to scale that up to a much larger society. So say a commune of 100 people or 200 people is going to have a different social, political, economic structure than one of 100 million, you know, 100,000 or 100 million. So the simple life doesn't scale up to much larger. And there's a book by Nicholas Christakis, I mentioned a couple people at dinner here, that called Blueprint. What's the right structure for allowing people to be their individual selves and have love and marriage and family and close friends and so on, and the larger society where you sacrifice somebody, your own benefits for the betterment of the group, because in the long run that's better for you, and so on. Okay, that's the problem to solve over the last 10,000 years, say. And so he's got, in chapters, he's got unintentional communities and intentional communities, which are like communes you're talking about here. Those unintentional communities are super interesting. Shipwrecks. So there's a database, somebody has a database of shipwrecks. There's been something like 9,500 shipwrecks in the last 500 years, all over the world. And so you start winnowing it out. We want people that crash on an island, and they survive, and then they're rescued so we can find out what happened, or else we don't know what happened. And then some of them succeed and some of them don't. And so there's been an analysis of what they did to survive or what they did, and it ended up in their demise. And so the general conclusion was having a relatively egalitarian, cooperative, horizontal structure, not so hierarchical, not so top-down command and control economy and political system, and so on. A lot, you know, on these sailing ships, usually there's a captain and a few officers and then the low-life sailors. And those that tried to maintain that hierarchical structure in their little commune that they set up unintentionally on this island for months or years, they failed. And that's what happened like when the HMS Bounty mutinied and they took the ship to Pitcairn's Island and they were there. That whole thing fell apart pretty quickly. They didn't have they had an asymmetry in sex ratio. There was like not enough women to go around, and so you can imagine what that led to. And then plus there were a couple of the officers still tried to lord it over the other sailors and the Polynesian men they took with them, and that whole thing fell apart. So the answer to your question is something like that. So democracies, the liberal democracies, are really the best of all the worst, as Churchill said. Because it's so messy, you have to kind of reset it every few years with elections and rejigger the laws and so on, because there is no answer.
All right, one more. On the way back there.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. The question is the placebo effect and why does it work? Just a experience I had, I was exhausted, and this homeopath or a naturopath gave me what was, I think, just water. And after that, I was refreshed, and I didn't believe in it. And I said, why does this work? And she said, because you believe in it. And I said, well, I didn't believe in it. And I'm a confirmed agnostic. I honestly don't know. And so can you explain the placebo effect and why something like this worked for me who didn't believe in this?
Right. Well, it depends on what the condition is. That sometimes just doing anything works. Making any kind of change.
You want to share your medical condition with us so we know what we're dealing with? No, I'm just...
Well, usually with placebo effects, it's subjective internal states like chronic pain, migraine headaches, things like this, that the measures themselves, the operational definitions of what you're measuring and you want to change to see if this modality changes it or that one or whatever, right off the bat, it's tricky because you say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your migraine today? It's an 8. Okay. I don't know what an 8 means. You know, the person, only they know, it's in their head. Okay, all right, so now try this and then, yeah, literally in their head. That's right, very good. Then they try something and it's a 6. Now it's a 6 or 5. Is that good? I don't know, because I don't know what the 8 meant. But I mean, if it's better, okay, good. And it's never something like, well, you have the HIV virus or you have the Hep C virus, and then we tried this, this essential oils or whatever, and then the virus is no longer detectable. That never happens, ever. There's no placebo effect for viruses. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much,
thank you.
Michael.
Thank you,
This was
Jesse.
excellent.
Thanks for doing the conference. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.